Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming to yet another talk about FRP. There's some repetition. We did talk that some of you may have seen at ICFP, but I promise it's a different topic, it's a different idea. So this is mainly the work of Manuel Perez, and he created the implementation, and this was the result of some discussions that we had based on the framework that we wrote together. So if whatever good you see here is his work, and if there's something you don't understand or that's wrong, that's my fault probably. I did something wrong in the slides. The question that we're trying to solve is the following. We have, say, a satellite, and we're trying to build a control system of this satellite. We have different devices providing data at different rates. And the question is, how do we coordinate this in a meaningful way? And how do we prevent mistakes from happening in this coordination? And this is more or less the way that we think about these control systems. And it's very similar to the way that controls people tend to think about these systems. And the difference is that we use a functional framework to do this. So the question is, if we have a reactive system that is consuming and producing data online, that is, it doesn't just take the whole thing and provides the whole result, but rather takes one sample and provides one output, and then another sample, and then another output, and so on. And we need to coordinate systems running at different rates. Ideally, what we want is we want failures in this coordination to be type-level errors, right? If we can. So we want some kind of assurances that we're doing things right, and we want wrong coordination to be a type-level error. And the framework that we use to implement this is called monadic string functions. And the idea of you probably can't see this, but the idea of a monadic string function is extremely simple. It's a function that takes one input sample and produces, in a monadic context, one first output sample and a continuation. And the monad is important. If you're familiar with other FRP frameworks like Yampa, usually you get the time and you don't have the monad. Here, you take the first input sample, and in a monadic context, you provide an output and a continuation. And then you use the continuation to take the next input sample, process it, provide the next output and continuation. And then you enroll the signal function. And the monad is extremely important. Now, I'll explain everything that we can do with the monad in a minute. But the language that normally you don't use that interface to actually program them. That would be too permissive. So you use arrows, right? And the idea is that you have these signal processors or sync processors, and you can combine them sequentially in parallel. You can lift a function and apply it point-wise to every input sample. And there's an API, a very large API that we provide. And one thing that you can also do is you can lift a Kleisli arrow. So you can lift a function that has side effects. And it takes the first input, processes it, has some side effect, and returns an output and a new continuation, which is the same thing for that lifting a pure function, a Kleisli arrow. And just one example, if you want to add one unit to an input stream that you get, all you need to do is lift the function plus one. I don't know how much you can see. Yeah, it's fine. You just need to lift the function plus one, right? And you could have a function with side effects that just prints every input sample to the output. And then when you put them together, all you do is you're saying that the first one, the monad of the first one is the ideal one. So these guys are insanely versatile because you can combine them with different monads, and then they have all kinds of effects. And these are things that we normally need ad hoc combinators in FRP implementations for. For example, if you use this maybe monad, then they take one input and they give you maybe one output and continuation, or maybe not, which means they terminate. So termination, which is something that in Yampa is called tasks, and the paper monadic string function talks about these constructs in a different way, from a different perspective, just arrives for free. You just need to use the maybe monad, and then you get it. So you have these orthogonal ideas of reactivity and termination or failure, and when you put them together, it just naturally combine to give you the obvious thing. And you have the same thing with either. Either gives you, you may be left with a result, or you may take the right branch and you can obtain an output and a continuation. And these are monadic string functions that terminate with the result, which is the basis of switching. And the if you use the list monad, then you get parallelism with broadcasting. So these are signal functions that just branch off and continue branching off and produce more than one result. And all of these just emerge naturally. And common things, at ICFP I talk about fault injection and fault tolerance, and for this we use the Reuter monad, among others. We can also use a probability distribution monad. And if you put time in the environment, if you make time globally available in a reader monad, then you can build FRP. So even though this is stream programming, FRP is about time, and this is not about time, this is more about reactivity, you still can build FRP. And we can do classic FRP, R-wise FRP, just based on all of this. So, there's a few other interesting properties. And this is why we're so excited about this framework, is that they have strong properties. For example, in the monad is commutative, the R-wise is commutative. And we have a proof of this. And if the monad is identity, then these are just standard stream functions. If the input is unit, they are data generators. And they are akin to just sources of data in reactive programming. If the output is unit, then they are sinks. They are places that you send data to. So they could model something like a network socket that you're using to send data out of your network. And still, the monad is explicit in the type, which is extremely important, because if the monad is pure, then these guys are pure, which means they're completely referentially transparent. Same input, same output. You can take a whole execution trace, run it, and you will get the exact same thing. And we have a time travel debugger to run these executions. So there's a few papers that we've written on these guys and the way that we're testing and so on. The question, just to explain in more detail and in this language, the question that we're trying to answer. Imagine that we have a simulation, and this is more or less how games work. You process input from a user, and these may be taps on the screen. They come in just random times. There is no clock driving this. And you have some game logic, you have some physics, and then you render this on the screen. Now, these guys run at completely different rates. The input just appears sparsely. The logic may be a bit more frequent, but it also has to be synchronized with the input. The physics needs to run really fast. And the rendering needs to be probably synchronized with the vertical sync of the graphics card. And coordinating this is actually harder than it looks, even though it looks like it's not complicated. There's a game called Magic Cookies, written in Haskell, that we put online on the iTunes Store and on Google Play. And the biggest source of bugs was that. So yeah, it's definitely non-trivial. It's a tiny, tiny game. It's less than 1,000 lines of code. And still, that was the biggest problem. So yeah, we don't want to do this manually. And what we want is, we want to have some sort of mechanism to make all things stick automatically for us in a meaningful way. We want a mechanism to communicate them also in a meaningful way, and in a correct way. And just going back to the example of the satellite that I was talking about, these are the ways that we're modeling these guys. So we have maybe data from a star tracker that we may pull at a particular frequency. We have data from an inertial measurement unit that we pull at a different frequency, and then we have to combine that. And we need to combine this in a meaningful way. So the way that we're going to solve this is in two steps, mainly. First is we're going to disable connections that don't make sense. And then we're going to enable mechanisms so that those connections can be recreated in a way that they do make sense. And to connect these systems at different rates, we have to do two things. We have to make the two clocks that drive the two systems running at different rates kind of like coordinate, and then we have to enable a mechanism for data to pass from one to another. And then at the end, we'll have kind of like a definition of a signal network that we can run. And there's a few definitions that we need to make all of this work, and one of them is time. We need a notion of time. And what we know about time is that we can calculate time differences. Time in FRP and in these frameworks always flows towards the future. So that's the only thing that we assume about the time. But the way that we're going to make time available to a reactive system is that we'll provide the time and the time since the last sample. And it's not so important that you look at the implementation, but this is just there so that it makes sense when you see it later. And you will see time info in the reactive definitions. And that means it has information about the absolute time and the time since the last time. So the first thing that we need to define is what is a clock? And a clock is just a signal that is ticking and is giving us times. That's it. That's a stream producer that is producing time units, time samples. That's it. And this is based on a monadic stream function. So it's a stream, I don't know if I can point with this. It's a monadic stream function that doesn't need any input and is producing time samples. That's the whole definition of a clock. And then to initialize it, you may need to initialize it in some kind of monad. Maybe you have some side effects like you need to start a clock somewhere, you need to start an IO ref, something like this. So the initialization may happen in a monad. This is a slightly simplified version. For the most part, the essence is here. And this is just one example. A basic clock is a clock, something that ticks as fast as possible. And this happens, for example, in many games, we just run the physics as fast as we reasonably can. And all that we need to know is first that the time domain is the UTC time that the processor is going to give us. And then the way that it's going to work is that at every input sample, this is lift and apply the arrow, at every input sample is going to get the current time from the operating system. And that's it. That's how we define a clock. And this is another clock that we saw before, which is the standard input. It's the one that waits until the user actually inputs something. And normally we would carry some information with it, but in this case I just simplified it a lot. And all it's doing is waiting for user input here. And then it gets the time. And it only produces samples when the user has actually pressed the key, enter key. There's a bunch of other clocks in the library. So now we can actually characterize signal functions by their clocks. So all we need to do is say that the monad has information in an environment about a clock that comes from a clock, using the type class that we see. And what's interesting about these guys is that the arrow is CLSF, the clock signal function, with the M and with the clock. Which means that we won't be able to connect it unless both the monad and the clock agree. So at this point, clocking errors become type errors. For example, one of the clocks that we have is a millisecond clock that just tries to tick, given an argument, it tries to wait those many milliseconds, and it uses the type level value of the integer that you provide to try to wait and approximate. And this type is different from this one, which means that when you try to connect them, they don't match. Okay, so now we have a way to discard connections that don't make sense. And what we have to do is enable connections in a meaningful way. And we have to enable both that they tick together and also that they pass data together. So the way that we define, the mechanism that we provide so that they tick together is a schedule. Essentially, a schedule, we provide there's no general mechanism to do this, but we provide a bunch of sensible schedules that just coordinate two clocks running together in some way. And you can run them concurrently, you can run them one and then the other, you can mix them in different ways, but the idea is that schedules capture the essence of having two clocks and having to decide which one is ticking. And together they kind of give you a combined clock that will provide information from one or the other. And the other thing that we need is a resampling buffer. And the idea of a resampling buffer is that it's kind of like a wormhole between two signal functions. On one end, you can put information, and this information comes in following this clock rate. The clock 1. You take the input sample, and you put it in a resampling buffer. And then you can get it from the other end, but you get it at this other rate. So the resampling buffer just captures the idea that you will have to downsample or upsample information. And again, we provide a lot of resampling buffers that do sensible things. For example, a FIFO resampling buffer that you can just output the first thing that it received, or a keep last, which is kind of like a zero order hold. It just gives you the last value that was received. And once you have these guys, then you can start combining again the different monadic stream functions that run at different rates. For example, you can just run it synchronously, which is what we already had, And that means you take a clock string function or another string function and just obtain a network that will run it with a clock. Or you can run it sequentially. And for that, you need a resampling buffer to communicate them. And that's the equivalent of the composition for arrows. But in this case, you need an extra argument, which is the resampling buffer that will enable that communication. And the signal network, in this case, does not operate on this clock or that clock. It operates on a sequential clock, which kind of does the right thing so that you can coordinate both things and move them along sequentially. And you can also put them together in parallel. And then you don't have to communicate them, but they run on a different clock. So essentially, as you start building these things, you get kind of like a tree definition of a clock. That is not just a clock that ticks more often or less often, but it's actually very sophisticated because it knows how to tick each element in the network independently. And at the top level, you have a signal network, and then you just give it the top level clock, and they have to agree. And then you can run it. And there's these three layers you have to communicate. You have to coordinate the clocks, you have to coordinate the resampling, the data communication, and then you put it together in a signal network, and then you can run it. And one of the things that I really like about this framework is that it's extremely clean. Because even though there's a lot of concepts, and this is an overly simplified version of the whole thing, you should really read the paper. It's very, very informative, and it has a lot of examples and a lot of, many more coordination mechanisms. But what Manuel has done very intelligently is that he's created these infix combinations that allow you to put things together in a clean way. And this says, well, this signal function ticks at a rate that is different from that one. But you can communicate them if you use this for data passing and this for clock coordination. And then this is a really clean definition. And back to the example that we had at the beginning, right? You have user input, and you write some logic, and then you render. And you get this kind of simple, clean definition, right? There's a few other things that we also, this is a very short talk, so if you have questions, fire away, and otherwise we'll finish early. There's a few other things that are in the paper, and one of the maybe best ideas about doing things this way is that in FRP there's this dual notion of behaviors and events. Behaviors exist in continuous time, and events exist in discrete time. And it's really difficult to make all of this uniform, right? And there's variants of FRP that just approximate events or continuous time, and then there's others that have dual notions, and it's really hard to coordinate them and to make them agree. And this just says that an event source is just a clock, right? And a behavior is a signal function that is clock polymorphic. It doesn't care about the clock. It's continuous. And it's just a very clean way of defining these terms. And other things that you will find in the paper is that there's an example that drives the paper along, and it explains very simply what all the things that we have seen. And different schedule mechanisms, and there's a long tour through the library that explains everything that it has. And I just want to give you very briefly kind of like a big picture of what this whole thing means. Because we started from a very simple abstraction that we presented in 2016. And suddenly we can do, with different choices of monads and different choices of extensions to this framework, we can do termination, switching, parallelism, locks, fault injection, add fault models, so that we have type-level information that tells us why something would fail. We can do continuous collision detection, well, a limited form of continuous collision detection, which in synchronous FRP is really hard to do. We can do classic FRP and arrowized FRP with the same framework. We can do standard reactive programming, and there's GTK-based reactive programming frameworks built on top of this. We can do, and they're isomorphic with some constraints. Well, they can model strings, monadic strings, and we can do purely functional testing. So we can record the input trace from a user or a real simulation, and then we can rerun the whole thing in a referentially transparent, predictable way. And suddenly we have clocks. We add clocks to this mixture by just adding one specific monad and then adding a few extensions that allow us to coordinate things in a meaningful way. So there's we're working on a few things. One of the things that I'm really excited about is trying to, there's some clock inference going on already. Like, the type checker knows how to fill in some polymorphic clocks for you. But I would like to have coordination mechanisms that also tell us that data passing only makes sense with certain clock coordination. And I would like this to happen automatically. The other is, at ICFP, I presented some work on fault tolerance. And the idea is that we're modeling satellite systems this way. And this is just a model, we're not actually running this on satellites. But it would be very interesting to show that these are also clock safe. And finally, we're trying to compile now, we're turning these monadic string functions into first order values so that we can then compile to other architectures, such as Arduino or constrained environments. And it would be interesting to have these kinds of assurances when we later compile these devices. So that's everything I have to say. As I said, short talk, 20 minutes only. So I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. If I can, as I said, yeah.
So yeah, we have questions.
Yeah.
So in one of your earlier slides, you said that you could represent events and behaviors as, if I understood correctly, a signal with a particular clock and a polymorphic function between signals or in clock, and I don't see how this relates to either events nor behavior, because an event does not tell you to act every...
Precisely. A clock also does not tick at every possible time. A clock only ticks at specific times, which is something that happens at discrete points in time. So a clock is kind of like, I gave you a simplified version of a clock that only tells you the time, but the definition in the library also carries an extra parameter with extra information. Now when you put these two together, what you have is that you have a monadic string function that is going to give you data at specific times, which is precisely what an event source is. An event source is data together with a point in time. And there's no continuity. Does it answer your question?
It sounded like your clocks were describing points in time where events were occurring that it was previously known which time, but for a particular event stream, it's the event stream that decides. So are you saying that like if there's an existential, there's some clock that says when those event occurrences?
I don't fully understand what you're... No, it's fine. I mean, we do have time.
I guess,
Yeah.
Can you get a fixed interval, or can you have clocks that vary how the time period is between ticks?
Right. So, for example, this clock, right here, right? This clock waits for the input from the user. So this, the time between ticks is completely unpredictable. So normally, like, as I said, this is the simplified version. Here, in the real implementation, there's a tab of time plus extra information. Normally, you could put something like the line here. And when you do that, then this is a thing that is going to give you the time sample and the next sample. So it's kind of like a source of information with specific time samples.
So each event stream has their own clock.
Each event stream has its own clock, yeah.
So you can't combine them.
Well, there's mechanisms to combine them. Okay. But you have to combine them in a meaningful way. You have to do it on purpose. You can't combine them wrong. Yeah. Yes. I don't know who.
Yep. Oh yeah. So let's say you have two functions that are synchronized to the same clock.
Yes.
Or you have two synchronizers, right? And then they get merged. Is that going to be equivalent to merging first and then synchronizing? Because now you have, get current time, but then you go get current time twice. So it seems kind of. Are there any, let's say, rules about how these?
That's an interesting question. The honest answer is I don't know.
Okay.
But I'm assuming that. I mean, in the limit, they should be the same. but you're absolutely right, and I don't know the answer to that. My assumption is that you're right in your suspicion that it would not be the same.
So could you elaborate what kind of benefits you get from using arrows within your library?
As opposed to what?
Monads, for example.
Like it.
Just plain monads.
Yes.
Well, the code is sequential. It's just hard to understand. Like this is compositional. This gives you. Well, it depends on how you use it or what you use it for. But this kind of code is relatively clear to understand. I mean, I always find monadic code less functional, less declarative. It's kind of like a step-by-step instruction. You need to know where you start from. It's like, but here it's the notational. It's telling you exactly what it does. Also, this is in this particular domain. This is closer to what controls people are doing. So if you look at their diagrams or specifications of reactive systems that they use, they look exactly like ours. So it seems like a good fit. But I guess it's also a matter of a bit of choice. You can take a look at some of the games that we have online, and that would give you an idea of what the reactive code looks like in an interactive application.
Where do we get the, is that in the paper?
What, the games?
Or, well, I guess where do you go find that stuff?
So if you start from, okay. The library is there. There's one example of a simulation, but for just to answer the question of why use ROIs for simulations more generally, a game that may help you answer this is Haskanoid, which I have on my GitHub. I'm sorry, I don't have the URL here. Yeah. And yeah, it's an Arkanoid implementation using YAML. A lot of hands up.
So, could you, so you've got monadic string functions,
Yes.
and they're arrows,
Yes.
but then you compose them into these signal networks,
Yes.
which seems like, which I guess those are not arrows.
No. Well, yeah, but you can only connect them if the monad and the clock agrees.
Right, I mean,
So
I
they
guess
are arrows, but if you want to connect them to something in which the monad and the clock do not agree, then you need to coordinate them.
right, I mean, I guess the question I have is, why do you need to move to these signal networks instead of just creating some combinators that allow you to make monadic string functions of different clock types?
I think
What's the benefit of moving to a whole different type?
I think in this case is, well, first is that it helps you structure what you're doing, right? Because the problem is the problem of coordinating the clocks and coordinating the data passing. And it helps you understand these two aspects. And the other is that it also helps you build the concepts that you need to get the syntax that we're looking for. So some of these concepts originally seemed a bit arbitrary, and over time they started gaining meaning. And but we were looking for a very specific syntax in which we have these two things separated, and we could combine them using, well, to get this.
So it's a notation for design.
Originally, well, I wouldn't call it notation driven, but definitely wanting the clean notation helped.
I think we'll take further questions offline.
Yes.
Thank the speaker.
Thank you very much.